All right, well, welcome. For the sake of those watching the recording, I'll introduce myself, even though I know all of you. My name's Abe Outsorn, and I'm a professor in the School of Nursing at the University of Western Ontario. And my work is largely around homelessness, health, mental health, and housing. But today I'm going to be talking to you about research methodology, which, isn't always the most exciting presentation that one gets to watch, but I'll try to make it interesting. It's a pretty cool methodology that we're talking about in terms of participatory action research, and so I'll try to use some examples and teach you in just the actual process of doing it and what that can look like. I don't profess to be an expert. I've done this myself, but only accidentally. So I'll tell you about my experience with my dissertation research and how the community actually pushed me into doing participatory work where I wasn't, where I had actually somewhat expressly planned on not going there. And I'll tell you a bit more about how that happened. But in terms of thinking about participatory action research, we have to begin by thinking about research and what is research and what are we doing with research. And one of the exciting parts about this methodology is it really does question some of our deep-rooted understandings of knowledge and how we create knowledge and what we do with the knowledge that we create. And it's a fairly new methodology, and it's challenging academia. It's really pushing the way that we think about the work that we do. But before we think about participatory action research in general, we think about research. And research is largely about the generation of knowledge. And so it's about taking a curiosity or a problem or a question and unpacking that to create some knowledge that we can then do something with. And so we start with a problem and we form that into a question. Now, before we get into the doing of the research, many of us do think about what's our philosophy. So where are we coming at this project from? And you'll see in participatory action research, there is a particular philosophy that it really sits with in terms of how we do the work that we do. So you start with understanding where you're coming from. What's your philosophical basis? What's your theoretical basis for the work that you're doing? And then you get into the methodology, and that's what we're learning today is a methodology. So the methodology is a guide. It's a guide for how you're going to go about your process. And so this could be very quantitative methodologies like structural equation modeling. Or it could be qualitative type methodologies like ethnography coming out of social sciences. So there's all different methodologies. But the methodologies guide you for what you're going to be doing. Then within that we have the particular methods. So methods are just the way that we get our data. So that can be interviews, focus groups, literature reviews, quantitative methods of surveying are the most common. And so we do the process through whichever methodology and methods we've chosen, and we come up with our results. And then we do something with those results. And really what participatory action research has grown out of is the question of that doing with the results. Because the tradition of science is we, the scientists, the researchers, create the knowledge, and then we put it out there. So research article or, more recently putting them onto social media or whatever. And then it's kind of hands off from there. That's our job is to create the knowledge. It's the job of others to put that knowledge into practice. And so what has been pushing us towards some of the participatory action research is that idea of perhaps we who generate the knowledge should also be the ones who think about what we're going to do with it and putting it into practice. So we're going to be talking quite a bit about that. I wanted to give you one example of research that challenges one of our first assumptions about science and how we generate knowledge. And it's an example that questions how we know things. It's a classic study. Timothy Diamond, a sociologist, and he was interested in nursing homes and concerned about some of the abuse that they were seeing in nursing homes, often perpetuated by personal support workers. And so the traditional science would go in and do a large randomized controlled trial. So we would do some kind of intervention, we would test half the people on that, the other half would just do usual care. We'd survey everyone with tools that we knew were reliable and valid tools, and we'd come up with some kind of an answer. And for Tim, he wanted to go deeper than that. He didn't just want to know what people were thinking at the time about what was happening, is he wanted to understand the whole flavor of the culture that was creating some of these situations. So what he did is he actually went back to become a PSW. So PhD in sociology, goes back and trains to become a PSW, and he works in these 3 different nursing homes and embeds himself right in there. And he doesn't lie to anyone. He says, I'm a researcher, I'm doing this as research, but I'm also working alongside you guys for a couple of years. And sure enough, in doing that, he sees a whole different picture, because the traditional approach in long-term care at this time had been, we got these PSWs and they're not very great people, they're not treating the patients very well, maybe we need to do more education for them, and maybe more legislation about kind of anti-abuse legislation. And so what he found by embedding himself in there was, of course, a much bigger picture. And he found that these individuals are working on a poverty wage, that they have some very set criteria around their work. So you have your 6 residents, you have to have them down to the breakfast room by 9 a.m. And there was no, in the whole process, everything that was benefited and recognized for their work was the expediency of their work. So the relationship that they developed with the residents didn't matter, because it wasn't rewarded or punished or anything. It didn't matter in how the work was structured. And so in doing that project, he was able to dig a lot deeper into issues around wages and even looking at the residents and what got them into long-term care, and their perspectives on the personal support workers, and basically just getting a lot richer picture than you could have ever gotten just by surveying everyone. So that's a story about knowing. So in the history of science, one of the key moments was around the 1960s, when we had other social movements going on. Those social movements transformed society and culture, but they also transformed academia. And so, a lot of academics were involved within some of those social movements as well. But we had been coming from this objective science, where it was about measuring and using the right tools and using large enough samples to get the truth. And that got challenged throughout the 60s and moving on into today, still getting challenged in what's known as a critical perspective. And so what a critical perspective suggests for researchers is that doing a survey and using means might get you some kind of truth that is best generalizable across the population, but there are people who fall outside of those means. And a lot of the critical researchers said those are actually the people who we're most interested in. And so who is it who, falls outside of that mean, and why, and what are their stories about? And so this is when science starts getting interested in things like marginalized people, social disaffiliation, empowerment and disempowerment. This gentleman here is a Brazilian named Paulo Freire, and he was concerned in Brazil about the separation between the ruling class and basically the peasantry, and what he was seeing was basically a feudal style society between the landowners and the rest of the population. And he was concerned about that, and he wanted to create some change. But was thinking about how do I actually facilitate change of a society in terms of the economics of it, of the politics of it. And so what he did is he started looking. He was an educator by training. He did research in education, and he started looking at literacy. And what he did is thought about how do we, because they had something like 80 to 90% illiteracy rates. And so he said, well, how can we help people become more literate? And so what he did is he went from community to community and helped create space for people to educate themselves around literacy within their communities, their villages. And that became a movement within Brazil, where the working classes started striving for something more. And this literacy was the thing that brought them together and also gave them the opportunities to push forward. That led to him getting ejected from the country for life, because it was very challenging to the structures of their society, but has been incredibly successful. And now we see Brazil as one of the four strongest rising nations. But that was, for him, that was research, but it was doing, and it was political, and it was personal, and it was empowering. But it was a whole different way of being in terms of doing research. So the debate on the sciencey side of things is this universal versus localized truth. Because the whole idea of science in its objective kind of past is to get that truth that we can use everywhere. Because when we're creating a medication, we want to make sure that a medication works for everyone. When we're creating a healthcare intervention, we want to make sure that that healthcare intervention works for everyone. But it won't always work for everyone. And there are truths that fit across science, but there are also local truths. And that's what a lot of critical research is about doing, is about uncovering those local truths. And so if we're thinking about creating answers to a problem, and so we're thinking about youth, we're thinking about mental health, we're thinking about trajectories of folks' lives, the answer, we know as practitioners, is not going to be the same for every individual. It's not going to be the same for every community. There are different answers, and those answers are often generated locally. We know this from the work we've been doing on international development. Our tradition on international development was kind of that great white knight who would come in and save the population, and discovered that it's the knowledge of what people need already exists in communities, and instead of coming in with the answers, we need to come in and give a space for the community to answer their own problems. And that's what participatory action research is built in terms of its scientific tradition. So I'll just mention a bit about my research project in terms of the to-do and how I accidentally ended up doing participatory action research. Because when I put together my project, I was looking at health and homelessness. Nurse by training, I was working at in a community health center, and I wanted to study the work that we were doing there. And talking to my committee, picking my methodology, they advised me, this is your dissertation, this isn't your life's work, and so it needs to get done at some point in time. And participatory methods tend to be this process that is ongoing and endless, which you'll see I have a diagram of. And so maybe that's something you can do later on. Why don't you just get your work done and have something that you can control a little more. And so I said, perfect, let's do that. In the work that I did, one of the primary concerns that came up was in the structure of that clinic. There was a lot of policy decision making that was happening, and it was happening without the clients or the patients in the picture. So that space of that clinic was really set up by the staff, by the management of how they wanted it to function, and they would have problems and challenges and questions that needed answering, and they were answering them just as the staff. And so one of the biggest things that came out of the project was that the patients or the residents or clients that I was interviewing really wanted to be a part of the process, of the policy making, but also of the research itself. And so I was running focus groups, which I had anticipated as just more data collection. But people were familiar with the project and the trajectory it was on. And so when I sat down with the focus groups, they said, okay, what are we going to do? Like, what's the What do we do about this? We want to fix it. And I wasn't there yet. I was like, I wanted to know more still, but they were ready to do. And I had to be responsive to that and say, okay, let's go with this doing thing. And so we worked on the clinic itself and some of the stuff that was happening there. But quite quickly as we continued to meet, they wanted to change more than just within that clinic. There were issues around town and activities and things that they wanted to do around the city and wanted to be involved with changing and building. And so what we ended up doing is one option was maybe we just protest and express our concerns, and that's something we could do. But what we ended up doing was creating a homelessness outreach network, which is a group that brings together people with lived experience, people, academics and students, and people with a passion to change the community, to build action around issues of homelessness in our city. And that was something I never envisioned from the outset of the project, but was pushed by the actual participants of the study to go that way. And so we'll talk more about how that actually works. So action research hails back to about the 1940s is when it first started showing up. Action research is that whole idea that we don't just create the knowledge, we do something with it. And so this was happening within organizational management business kind of research. Right? So they were looking at processes of management, and so then they didn't just look at them, they actually started implementing them, right? They'd implement the process, see how it was going, get feedback from the staff, and keep kind of this ongoing, continuous quality improvement kind of stuff. So that was action research, same in education. So we've done this for, decades, if not centuries in education, is trying new ways of learning, of testing, working with our students to come up with new things and putting them into practice. Same with community development. So community development often very connected with research, same thing, right? So you work with the people, come up with ideas, put them into place, see how they go, change them up, try something different, and it's this continuous process of putting what you're learning into action. Participatory research, similar to action in that there's a sense of taking the knowledge and doing something with it. Participatory research really is about the involvement of the research subjects, the research participants in the process. And so if you remember, I laid out the different parts of the research process. The participatory asks, where are people involved? So are we the ones coming up with the problem and the question, picking the methodology, and maybe they're involved in disseminating the results? Or are they coming up with the question? Or are they part of the data collection? Are we actually kind of training people to participate in collecting the data? And there's no set way, there's no right way, there's no one way. It's really up to the team to decide how that's going to happen. Within the context of our study, it's really within the methods and within the process of the data collection and the action and the dissemination that we're picturing people being involved. So actually working with the youth so that they can run the groups and facilitate and collect the data and share their findings and come up with new problems and questions. And so that's what participatory research is about, is involving the subjects as parts of the process. So there's a lot of pieces involved with participatory action research, and I think what you should see as a nice tie to what I was saying about kind of that critical tradition of empowerment, of emancipatory research. And so participatory action research involves us learning together. So in the same way that we're generating knowledge, hopefully the community should be learning knowledge about itself. Again, very much with community development kind of tradition. The other thing that's very important for people is when they engage in a project as research participants, very often, almost always, it's because they want some kind of change. So yes, I will do your study on, I don't know, whatever it is, internet use and students in the university and success. They want to do that because they want you to come up with something that's going to make students more successful. So the participants have a vested interest in participating in this study is because they either want something for themselves or for their community or for their peers. And so the reasons why youth would participate in a study on structural violence is because they would hope that somehow we could change some of those structures so that even if they don't benefit, the youth coming up behind them won't suffer from some of the same challenges that they experienced. And so the change, the idea of creating change is a very important part of this piece as well. Because again, like I said, the tradition of research was we just create the knowledge, let someone else figure out the change. Participatory action research, it's us coming together to create the change that people want. So and I already talked about the involvement of the community and that authentic participation. So this is where it gets really tricky because there's like the reality and then there's the ideal. And so there's certain realities as researchers we're faced with, funding cycles and budgets and reports and timing and so, you know, it's always easier for us to control everything. If we control everything, then it's all fits within what we have to do. But the ideal, of course, being that full participation and that genuine participation. So token participation would be, you know, we do everything and then we let you present the findings and we say, there, you're participating. But I mean, are those their findings? No, those are our findings. How could we make it so that they're actually their findings? Are they involved in the process of getting the findings? Writing them up, are they the ones interpreting what they're seeing in the project? And that's one of the nice things about the arts-informed research is that the participants are really interpreting that knowledge. They're explaining what they're creating. And so they're giving us the answers from their work. In terms of the self-critical communities, this is that creating space for people to really reflect on their community, their culture, their role in their world. And so for Freire, that example I gave from Brazil, what he noticed when he was going out to these villages is a lot of the folks were just saying, you know, this is the way it is. This is, we work, we create stuff, and the landowner, you know, pays us a little bit, and that's life. That's how things are. And so there wasn't kind of the space for them to think that life could be any different. And that's what these literacy sessions became, is a chance for people to reflect on their culture, their communities, their structures. And so that's what we also want to do for the youth. A lot of them kind of can tell you the things that don't work for them. So this was, you know, the way this was set up with, you know, the exit from children's aid at 18, it just was stupid, it didn't work. But don't always have that luxury of that space to really think to that bigger picture about, you know, what is childcare services in our culture and why do we have them and what do they look like and how could they be the same, how could they be different? And so that's a lot about what, again, with arts-informed methods is creating that space for people to start thinking to that bigger picture. And also thinking about, you know, where do I fit into this story? And how can I be a part of changing it? If this is something that I've suffered from, how can I be a part of creating an alternative? And so that gets into the empowerment. And the important thing about this is the idea of a space where communities empower themselves. Because again, the tradition of empowerment is how can we empower people? And it's a sense that we have this power that we can bless upon the vulnerable or the marginalized. But instead it's thinking about how can we create that space. Because we do have some benefit. We have access to resources, access to education, and so we shouldn't ignore that. But the sense is we can use the resources that we bring to the table to create a space where people can empower themselves, come up with their own solutions, build their own knowledge and understanding. And it's a privilege of us to be included in a part of that. So thinking to the bigger levels and deconstructing some of those assumptions that people have about their life and the way their life is structured. So I mentioned the ongoing nature of this process, and that's, again, in terms of the reality of what research looks like in academia today, this is difficult because when we're working with folks on changing culture and structures, it's not a process where we just get in there for 2 years and then we're on our way. But really, if we're saying we're going to come alongside and partner with you, it's a long-standing relationship that we're committing to, where we're going to come up with some solutions and we're going to try some things, but that's just going to generate some more problems. And so we'll work together and you'll come up with some more solutions. And so it's that ongoing, very much like community development, that ongoing process of working together and being invested in a community to try to create change. And it's not intentional that it's a downward spiral. It could be an upward spiral as well. So what are we, I've talked about creating change, changing culture. What are we creating change for? I mean, it's really the participants will help you find your way in what they want to change. But it can be anywhere from kind of that individual level and that kind of developing some personal skills for creating change in people's own lives, but it can also be social, so creating change in how people work together. But it can also be higher level in terms of actual values and the actual understandings of people's own understandings of their culture, of their communities, of the structures that they move in and out of. So you can see there's a natural flow that if we're going to create a space where people can think broader, they're going to want to change things at a higher level, right? And so often in our kind of biomedical based understanding of mental health or even physical health, the change is all often focused on the individual, right? So, how can we build your personal skills and how can we help you have the right tools? But that's like a Band-Aid, right? That's the downstream. The downstream is the individual, but what's the upstream? What's the culture, the structures that have got someone to that position? And so if we're zooming people out in what they're looking at and thinking about in the world, that's also going to zoom out what they want to change. Because then it's like, I don't want to just change myself and my mood. I want to change, the youth justice system and this criminal record that was supposed to be disappeared, but my employers keep finding ways to get at. And so it creates a higher level, and it's harder. It creates bigger questions and tougher issues to change than the personal issues. So the values, I don't think will be any surprise to you at this point in time. Of course, valuing the intelligence, the skills of the people themselves, understanding the answers to community problems exist within the community itself, and that's that local knowledge versus that generalized truth. Obviously practical, down to earth, so people, if they're going to be invested in the project, they want to see outcomes. They don't want to just be thinking all the time. They want to be acting and seeing that something is actually getting better. Balancing maybe our high-level perspectives and things that we think is wrong with the world and what the participants really want at this moment in time. Because we may want to change the world. They may want to just change their community. And the intersubjectivity, which means that we have our understandings, others have their understandings. Somehow we need to bring those together. So the way we see the world and the way our participants see the world are going to inform each other and challenge each other, hopefully. But hopefully what we come up with is a shared understanding. There's 1,000 examples we can talk about of really cool things that people have done. Just one example that I was reading recently was Aboriginal teachers in Northern Australia. And they had their education system that they were working within. And there was some concerns about the way that education was being delivered, and even the way that they were being educated as teachers. So going to teachers college and learning a certain way of being and a way of teaching, and even their content, which they were then bringing back to their communities, and it was feeling like a misfit. It wasn't working out the way that they envisioned it. And so wanted to actually change the way that teachers were educated to work in their communities, and to localize some of that education so that it reflected the culture of their communities, rather than going off and kind of bringing this new and different way of being and different culture back. And so it was the Aboriginal teachers themselves who came up with the problem and worked through it and came up with solutions and tried them out, and continued to work in their communities to try to improve their education they're delivering. But you can think of all kinds of different populations who are marginalized or vulnerable or disenfranchised, and how they might, if they had some space and some resources, challenge some of the things that they're experiencing and come up with solutions for those. So ultimately, our goal is not knowledge generation. That's part of the path, is creating knowledge, but ultimately it's that change. So changing people or changing the context in which people find themselves. And so we create knowledge to get there, but we don't stop there. We use that knowledge and put it into practice, and ultimately try to improve things with individuals obviously involved in the process. So that's participatory action research in a nutshell. I saw some nods along the way, and I'm open to questions or comments or examples of things that you've been doing that you think really fit with this. So the comment was just that it's making Maria reflect on some of the challenges in terms of the timing and the funding, and what are our expectations in terms of where to go. And absolutely, I mean, ideally, you pace yourself at the pace of the participants, right? So it's where are they at, like what are we willing to tackle and cover at this point in time. And obviously we have set outcomes of our research that we've put in our proposal that our funder is expecting. And that's a real fine dance. And that's why you don't do it for a dissertation. Is what skill set are we looking for? Because as a qualitative researcher, I'm used to extracting information from people. That's the skill set that I bring, is I'm going to do an interview with you, and I'm going to get you to really go deep and give great information. In doing participatory, a lot more of it is about managing groups of people, and I mean, this is the art therapist's group skills, right? Is I'm bringing a bunch of people around a table to work through some difficult things, and how do we manage the relationships in that room, and the expectations, and keep people focused and enthusiastic, and I mean, it's a whole different skill set. Yeah. So one of the underlying questions in doing a project is like, what's the degree of pragmatism versus kind of the idealism? And this ties in to some of the discussion as well. So at times people will say, we're looking for participants who, are not experiencing crises of life. So looking for those in terms of that self-actualization triangle who, maybe housing is stable and access to food and addictions and whatnot are stable, so that, they have that space where they can go to the next level. But that would be kind of like the very pragmatic, we're only having one group, we got to make sure we get as much bang for the buck out of this group, so we're going to really focus our recruitment. Others, of course, are just thrown wide open. It's community, anyone can come who feels a part of the community. And so maybe that means it's a lot slower, because we're going to spend the first 7 sessions like my OW worker's a jerk. And so that's gonna absorb a lot of our time and energy. But if we've got the luxury of that time and energy, then we hope we can get somewhere else. So it's the pragmatism of how much time, what are we going for. In terms of the actual methods of how we access people and work with people, it's wide open. It's a methodology, so it just tells us kind of how we're doing it. In terms of the doing itself, we can be doing surveys of people's, how they feel about their ability to create change. We can be doing surveys on empowerment, or we can be doing qualitative or arts or whatever. Yeah, it doesn't prescribe methods. The question is, if you're focusing on those who are in the space that are ready to critically reflect, you're likely taking those away who are kind of on the furthest on the margin. Absolutely. Yeah, and so that's why it's that kind of what's the pragmatics of it in terms of our time and our ability to work with everyone. I mean, if you presented that to, some kind of ethics board, they would say that's terrible. You're tainting yourself. You're getting invested in the community. You're losing your objectivity. You're throwing away the science by saying that we need to change this part of this culture, and that the people in the culture have identified and are working on creating this change. And so it is a very novel idea of what we count as research. But on the other side of the coin, it fits. I mean, when you get a group of researchers in a room and ask them why they do what they do, it's not because they just love reading research papers. I mean, we do this because we all have a passion for a better world in some way or another. Whether that's, I do cell biology because I'm concerned about Parkinson's disease, or whether that's I do, qualitative work because I want to end homelessness. I mean, we all have our passions. So on the one side, that idea of creating change really challenges our sense of objectivity and rational science. The same side, it fits with kind of the human part of what we're about and why we even do the work that we do, right? Having yourselves and your experiences and expertise, and I think it's great. I think that's going to be represented across the country, right? We've got the right partners in place who can do this kind of work with the youth and do that kind of knowledge generation and change making are what the agencies we're working with are used to doing. They might not have some of the same language around it, but they've got the skills because they've been doing it for years, right?